keep this train moving. So our next session seems to have a strange title, maybe, 1955 to 2055, a Documenta century. And it's interesting, I think, following Masha Kirasarova's talk, 1955, of course, and the founding of Documenta, a kind of one of the a gesture in reaction to Germany, the immediacy of Germany's post-war condition, and of course a period of the beginning of the sort of the acceleration of the Cold War, bifurcation of the planet. And so in the spirit of meanwhile history, which is interested in lost, erased, or forgotten histories, we wanted to turn that prism towards Documenta. And I'm sure all of you know what Documenta is, but since 1955, it's an exhibition, a museum that lasts for 100 days in the German town of Kassel, and happens every 5 years, and is considered, of course, by many to be one of the major epoch-making or era-making statements in the contemporary and the historical art world. So it gives us really great pleasure to be able to bring together some of the protagonists from the history of Documenta and also its immediate future. So I'd like to introduce Catherine David. She's an art historian whose research has focused on contemporary art from the Middle East. She served as a curator for the Centre Georges Pompidou and the Galerie Nationale des Jeux de Paume. Catherine was the artistic director for Documenta 10 in Kassel and the director of the Witte de Witt of Centre of Contemporary Art in Rotterdam. To her right is Okwui. He's a scholar, a curator, and a writer. He's currently the director of Haus der Kunst in Munich, and Okwui served in several leading biennials and international exhibitions, including the one after Catherine, Documenta 11, 1998 to 2000. He was recently appointed director of the visual arts sector of the 56th Biennial of Venice, which is, so I think that's also going to be an interesting possible comparison there. And then, speaking of the future, our third guest is Adam Szymczyk, and Adam is the director and chief curator of Kunsthalle Basel. In 2008, he co-curated with Elena Filipovic the 5th Berlin Biennial for Contemporary Art under the title When Things Cast No Shadow. And just this last year, he's been appointed as the artistic director of the next Documenta, number 14, to take place in 2017. And so our guide through this imagined century, or the question of how to assemble a future from possible fragments of a forgotten past, is, of course, the ever-present, the ever-peripatetic Hans-Ulrich Obrist, who doesn't need much introduction, I think. So I'm going to hand over to Hans-Ulrich now. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shumon. Is it working? Yeah. And before starting, I just want to say that I thought it would be important to dedicate this panel today to the memory of Jan Hud, who died a few weeks ago, lived from 1936 to 2014, and did obviously an important Documenta, one of the first Documenta, actually the second Documenta I saw, and just wanted to quote here Pascal Martin Taillou, our friend, who tweeted and Instagrammed, "Let's join Mr. Jan up there for the next party." So this in memory of Jan Hud. This is a very, free conversation today. I mean, we somehow not going to focus only on this aspect, of course, of fragments from the past, because I think it will be interesting to look at many different aspects of Documenta. Schumann, of course, when he defined this whole idea, Eric Hobsbawm being somehow the main inspiration for this year's Global Art Forum, it's interesting to kind of look at that in terms of exhibition history, and this idea how we can actually look at exhibition history and fragments of exhibition history as a toolbox to invent the past. And I mean, looking this morning at Jens Hoffmann's wonderful new book, which published by Thames and Hudson, which looks at 50 recent exhibitions, and Documenta 10 and 11 are part of that, which somehow since 1990 changed the rule of the game and changed exhibition history. It's kind of interesting to see how memory of exhibition is written, and obviously the exhibition having a limited lifespan, I think there are many different very urgent measures to somehow think about memory of exhibition, but also sort of think about where exhibition comes from, because exhibitions always come from somewhere. And in the introduction to this very book, T.J. Clark is quoted, who wrote in his opening chapter, 1973, Image of the People, that in its best form, art history should be about the connecting links between artistic form, the available systems of visual representation, the current theories of art, other ideologies, social classes, and more general, historical structures and processes. Now, it's interesting, I think, in terms of where exhibition comes from, particularly to look at such seminal exhibitions like Documenta, and maybe wonder what are kind of models from the past which have inspired them, exhibitions from the past which have inspired them. I was also thinking it could be interesting to somehow maybe look into this idea to which extent the local context is important. I mean, I don't know much about Kassel, but I think it's interesting as a context. One of the things I always thought was hugely inspiring is, of course, the late Lucius Burckhardt, who taught in Kassel, a Swiss sociologist, whom we are revisiting at the moment with Herzog Demeron for the Architecture Biennale in Venice. And Lucius Burckhardt invented a whole new science called strolology. It's a science of going on a walk. It's a kind of a flânerie, a promenade, which he installed surprisingly as a true academic discipline in Kassel University. He organized these amazing walks from Wilhelmshöhe down to the city, where everybody would have a walking stick, and other walking sticks would say, here it's beautiful. And then obviously, little by little, when people got out of the park and they got into the city, it's very awkward to have that walking stick. He organized weird performances where he would put the Zebrastreifen, a kind of a pedestrian stripe, into the city to block the traffic and interrupt it in an enormous fluxus type of happening way, the Christmas traffic in Kassel. So, I mean, that's kind of the only thing I know about Kassel, but I'm sure for those having worked in Kassel and done a Documenta, there are many more inspirations, from Kassel. So it will be interesting to see, what kind of the local context can be as an inspiration. And then I think one thing which will be interesting is this idea of the rules of the game. And in some kind of way, Richard Hamilton, whom I would also like to remember here as a great inspiration, he always said, quoting Duchamp, of course, that we only remember exhibitions which also invent a new rule of the game. A new display feature or something like this. And if we look at anthologies, Jens Hoffmann's one is the most recent one, but there's obviously Bruce Altschuler's extraordinary books which look in 2 volumes into the exhibition history of the 20th century. There are actually astonishingly few documentas and biennales in these books. It's very often also smaller exhibitions, and it seems to be a great challenge on the scale of such a huge exhibition to come up with a new rule of the game or a new display feature. Of course, Documenta 10 and 11 both did that, and so it will be very interesting, I think, to hear from Okwui and from Catherine about their invention. I mean, very often the retro perspective of Catherine, but also the 100 Days and 100 Guests are quoted as such an invention of a rule of the game, and of course, Okwi's invention of the platforms would be another example. So these just a few aspects which I thought would be interesting to cover in connection also to Schumann's topic. And maybe to begin with the beginning, I wanted to ask Catherine and Okwui to tell us about what were their toolboxes for their Documenta, what were fragments from the past, exhibitions from the past, which inspired you to do Documenta.
I mean, I don't think it was really about exhibition from the past. It was more, it's between, sometimes we would laugh about Kassel too, but I think that in the case of Documenta 10, it was quite important in the whole building of the event, especially after having received a very strong comment from the board telling me that my contract was made for me working in Kassel and not having any, at the time we didn't say platform, with satellites, and that I was not allowed to have any satellite in Tehran and the other one, I don't know if it's, I think it should have been Sao Paulo. Anyway, so, you know, times are changing, as the song say. You know, at that time it was also not just because about Kassel, which is a very special city due to its history, due to the war and so on and so forth, but also because it was really the last, and this was not my decision, it was the last, it was a fact, it was the last Documenta of the century, and it was also corresponding with a moment where, when it was very visible, you know, Kassel was like a very, very obvious, strong and sad symptoms of many things which were changing in Europe and in the world. So, you know, you could see from very close, as soon as you would, of course, leave your office and be into the city and so on, a lot of symptoms of economical problems, unemployment, drug addiction, you know, Kassel being heavily affected. So from then on, we really began to think about what it could mean to be in Kassel. As I was asked to do an exhibition in Kassel, what could it mean to be there? So not to play the game of, because you spoke about walking and looking at works and the promenade. And I might like promenade as many people, but I don't like what I call les œufs de Pâques, how do you say in English, les œufs de Pâques? Eastern eggs research, you know, that you are there and trying to see one of the works. It's really something which is, for me, extremely irritating, and I think it's not very, very good for the audience, and it's not very, probably giving a lot to the works. And so we really began to work with Fabrizio Galanti and a few other people about trying to understand the city, how it worked, how it was working, and trying to articulate a parcours in the city so that people could have a meaningful promenade. Of course, they could leave, they could zap anytime they would decide, but at least you had something of a written parcours in the space. So this was an inspiration, and after I don't want to speak too far, so, and I don't want to offend the memory of Jan, but it's also clear that Documenta 10 was happening after one which had been, let's say, more empathic to the spirit of the time, and 10 was less empathic to the spirit of the time, and of course it was a little bit disturbing, surprising for a certain number of people, and that's why from the beginning it became a little bit polemical.
And can you maybe talk about the invention of these retro perspectives? Because in some kind of way it seems very interesting. You know, we looked earlier today at the video of the late Eric Hobsbawm, who was such an inspiration, and he always said we need a protest against forgetting. And in relation to the topic, you know, of this global art form of memory, I think it's very interesting how you somehow revisited past artists through contemporary artwork through this formula. Can you somehow tell us how this works?
It's very simple, you know, the idea to convocate works from the recent past and corresponding to works which had been produced by artists who were young, who were beginning to work when the first document happened, 55. And so meaning this generation from the 60s. And so that, of course, not inviting all of them, not inviting all the 60s and 70s because it had been a very strong moment, but trying to invite a certain number of works, attitudes, cultural proposals, which could be meaningful in the moment where we were. So looking to the past, but from now, and for going further, not for being nostalgical, not for giving the idea that everything was much better in the past, and so on and so forth. So it was really the notion of retro perspective. You look back in order to go, I don't know if faster, which is maybe not interesting, but better ahead.
And maybe one more question was about the 100 days and 100 guests, because in French, very often lectures and discursive aspects are described as une manifestation annexe in museums. I used to work, you know, in France, one would always describe this as an annex event, as something which isn't central. And what is, I think, so important about the 100 days and 100 guests is that you made that very central. It wasn't kind of a hierarchy. Can you tell us a little bit about that rule of the game and how the 100 days and 100 guests idea came to you?
Yeah, I think you really put your finger on the nerve, because it was really from the beginning, and it was also very visible in the way the team was functioning, not to have the exhibition and the rest, though that we had a very strong dynamic and combinations between the exhibition, the working for the book, and the 100 days, the 100 guests, and a few other, like the hybrid space and a few other ones, which were conceived, and especially the 100 days, 100 guests, for many reasons. One, because at that time it was, and it still is, I think, when we are, if we are honest, very difficult to pretend that, or you have to be very cynical, which I'm not, to pretend that the world is transparent. The world is not transparent. We still have to face with a lot of opacities, for being polite. And so I really wanted that a certain number of absences could be problematized in a way through discourse, that a few elements of the complex global cultural dispositive would be there, not in absentia because we had real bodies and beings, but there in another way. One. Second, I also wanted, because when you spoke about the exhibition dispositive, to make very clear that, and it's not so new, you know, some people are playing the fool, telling us that this is new. It's not so new that we know that the aesthetical reception, that the way we look at the work is not just about looking at an object, and that many things are happening outside of the object, and so on and so forth, and much before Marcel Duchamp. And of course, it went much further from the late 50s on. And the idea was to make people aware, and of course, the dispositive of an exhibition in a document, in Kassel, is a little bit different than what it is in the MoMA or Beaubourg or one more, let's say, homogeneous space. And I really wanted to make people aware that what we could call the borders of the exhibition, the limits, the walls, but I prefer the notion of border, are always porous borders, poreux. So it's all affected and infected by discourse, by memories, by misunderstandings, and so on and so forth, and that all this would be really the purpose of the 100 Dead, 100 Guests. And of course, when you say not annexed, it's you have also to be very pragmatical. If you don't want and even to be annexed, you have really to push it to the center. So I began to work in terms of concentric circles, that you had, you know, one thing echoing in another one, and making the program very precise and available, and that so that some people, and not some, because when I checked with many people I knew, or people in the audience, because I stayed there the 100 days, so I can tell a little bit of what happened in the atmosphere. But it was absolutely obvious that many people decided the date of their visit according to what they would be interested in the 100 days, 100 guests. For them, it was not kind of annex, it was something eventually really part of the event. I think Documenta is more an event than an exhibition.
And I remember I spoke at the time with Etienne Balibar, and he told me that he thinks, opposing to what he called the irreversible aspects of globalization, so uniformity or homogeneity, that he actually sees a need for exhibitions to become nomadic, to be physically and mentally traveling across borders. So he actually described this idea how an exhibition can go beyond boundaries of nation or languages or cultures and go in all directions, to spill out in all directions, to broaden the horizon. And actually, exhibitions can become borderlines themselves. So it's obvious that that happened with the 100 Days and 100 Guests. But can you tell us how you did that with the exhibition? How did the exhibition address that?
I mean, you know, it was extremely, you know, for instance, I remember Etienne Balibar with a philosopher and a political philosopher, so not at all the kind of person you would expect, you would ask to discuss art, unless it's theater, because he belongs to a generation which was very, very interested in theater, the immediate post-war generation. So he went for giving his talk. He asked me to make tours. I went with him, and I got very, very irritated phone call from Hortensia. I think, Catherine, what are you doing with Etienne? You are away for 4 hours now. And just because he was absolutely interested in the works, he had amazing comments on Atlas, of course, of Gerhard Richter, but many other works. And he asked me if he could give another lecture after the one he would give the same day on political politics of the, précisément, of the border, of the frontier. And I said, of course, you're welcome, Etienne. If you want to give another talk, it's absolutely possible. So it went from this to other people who had no interest at all in the exhibition, and including people I will kind enough for not mentioning because they pretend they are art lovers. But the idea was not to the 100 days, 100 guests was not supposed to be the comment on Documenta. I invited Marco Pitz, who is an anthropologist, and for introducing his research on culture without unwritten, or people who are not writing. And so I said, okay, and it was very dry. I said, Mark, you should really be a little bit, yes, I said, yes, and he came with amazing drawings and things that the people will leave after 10 minutes. And it was absolutely packed. So, it's also a very interesting point is that when you tell people in advance, people are more potentially more interested than you would expect on many, many things. But, it was not at all conceived as only a commentary about Documenta. I know because we should also pay homage to Mike Kiley. And he asked me if I would really like to perform my history of rock and roll. So I was like, okay, we'll produce the rock and roll night. So, it was really very, the thing is to take a lot of time, and it's not at all a supplice, so it's absolutely amazing to be with these people, But to take the time, to give you the time to come to the point, so that things are becoming very organical, and that each one is participating out of his field. And when you want people to be inventive and eventually to get a little bit out of the field, it takes time. It takes, even Edward Said or Rem Koolhaas are real things sometimes, better than me when I'm speaking.
Now, what is interesting is that aspect of the nomadism leads us right away, Okwui, to your Documenta, and not so much Balibar, but I remember Edouard Glissant was a great inspiration. Something we always shared is this obsession for Glissant, and you came up with this invention of the platforms, and I remember Glissant at that time, he always spoke about the problem of large museums. He was inventing this museum in Martinique, which sadly never came to fruition. It's his big unrealized project. He wanted to create a museum, the first kind of art museum for Martinique, and he had artists from Mata to Wilfredo Lam helping him. And but for this unrealized project where he had all the notes, he was always saying the problem of a large-scale exhibition or the problem of a large-scale museum is that it's a continental logic, and we should not have in the 21st century continental logic, but it should be more of an archipelago. And in some kind of way, your invention of the platforms has a lot to do with this Glissantian idea of the archipelago, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the genesis of this idea and what prompted it.
Well, first and foremost, thank you. I think it's really great to share the podium with Catherine and Adam. And exhibitions like Documenta, in many ways, need a foil. And for Catherine, the foil may have been maybe resistance to Jan Hut's Documenta. Unto the time. And for me, Catherine's Documenta was a powerful foil, a very important foil, in a sense. And it was a great privilege on the one hand, but also to follow, and at the same time terrifying, to follow Catherine's Documenta 10. And I tell you why, because of, in terms of Documenta, the term large scale is not what I will use to describe Documenta, but the term ambitious. I think it is a one exhibition, one event that one can really say that ambition is what you bring to it. It's ambition that enables you to believe that you can do 100 days and 100 guests. And therefore, for me also, taking that as a point of departure, looking at the frontiers and the boundaries constructed by Catherine, my sense of Documenta was a horizon. the horizon of the possible. And in that sense, I began thinking, initially when I was invited, I thought, what could I possibly contribute to this? My immediate experience of Documenta was only like less than a year, seeing Catherine's show, which not only was very vivid, but absolutely vital. I still remember just about every room. And for me, that's the sign of a great exhibition, that you know what you saw, when and where. I remember the shape of the rooms. I was deeply affected by the Kulturbahnhof, the train station. It was the very first time it was used. On top was Pistoleto's installation with your Getty Menos, and below, directly immediately below, was Elio Oiticica. And this expression of horizontality, between the two exhibitions, was for me incredible and powerful. And I say this only to say that the platforms, on the one hand, was a response to two things. One, I had conceived of Documenta as having come in three different eras. The first was what I call the Arnold Bode years. Arnold Bode founded Documenta in 1955, and this would have been the same time, the same year that the non-aligned movement met in Indonesia. So, to talk about histories, I think it's important because it bears a relationship to this notion of a horizon that one wanted to construct. So, if Documenta was founded in 1955 as a kind of post-war response to the evacuation, to annihilation of modernism in the Nazi era, the non-aligned movement was also founded precisely at a point when this bifurcation of the world into two realms was being constructed. So that outside, so the non-aligned movement was trying to construct an outside to that. And so that for me was deeply influential. So that the Bode years was from 55 to 1968. And this, you can say, was constituted by a series of exhibitions that were classical reenactments of the historical avant-gardes and the new avant-gardes, movements, modernisms, and so on. And then came a break with Harold Zeman, and this is where the second era begins for me. And this second era was really that somebody was responsible. Somebody had to be guilty of something. And it was, for me, the subjectivity of the curator that really defined this particular move from 72. It's also very interesting because Zeman was not known as the artistic director then. He was known as the general secretary. The term artistic director had not been invented. It was known as the general secretary. So I was trying to sort of be a good student of Documenta in this sense. And I think I'm just responding in the spirit of this notion of history, boundaries, borders, frontiers, in order to construct this horizon. And looking back, I think there are many reasons why Zeman's Documenta was seen as absolutely pivotal, absolutely essential. But what is missing in the understanding of Zeman's exhibition was also some missed opportunities. Because I was working at the Art Institute of Chicago then, and I had asked a research assistant to help me, to find me everything about Documenta. And to my surprise, and this is the greatness of the library in that institution, there were all these documents, and one of them was talking about an artist, David Medalla, who Zeman had invited in 1972. And Medalla was informing Zeman of this great Brazilian artist that he knew, that they are really wonderful, that he should absolutely invite them. But they were not invited. It was Leisure Clark, Elio Oiticica. There are documentations about this. So Medalla was disappointed. Therefore, he invited Oiticica, Leisure Clark, and some of these artists to participate in his own project called A Stitch in Time. And I was to learn about this, much later because we presented that Stitch in Time in Johannesburg Biennale in 1997, because it's a project that continues. So there again was a missed opportunity. So the third era was the break from Zeman, where, of course, the first woman to organize Documenta. There's a certain it's also a generational shift that Catherine was the mark of a new era in the history of Documenta. So how was I going to respond to this? And it also, in a sense, marked a conclusion, if you will, because it was the last Documenta of the 20th century. And so in my story of horizons, there was a sense of restoration in Catherine's Documenta, but also a radical break from the previous Documentas and so on. And this sense of restoration has to do with that experience of Oiticica and Pistolator. And of course, there was Alicia Clark and many artists, many great works, Richter's Atlas. The choice to show Atlas as opposed to the paintings, for me, was also very important. And then, of course, further on, beyond Atlas, on the same wing was art and language. So I can, again, make the parcours of this particular exhibition inside the Fridericianum. But the challenge that I faced was, how do I make a Documenta that was not inattentive to all these different problematics that have been set up? So my horizon began in '55. This confluence of the non-aligned movement and Kassel. But in order to do that, I also wanted to emphatically, refuse the idea of the territorialization of this discourse. I wanted to deterritorialize Documenta. That was the point of the platforms. And the idea itself really came standing in Kulturbahnhof. I had already presented my my ideas, my program, but it was not known as platforms then. But I was standing in Kulturbahnhof, and as you know, is the old train station in Kassel. And what struck me was the idea that it was simultaneously a terminal and a terminus. This, relationship was very interesting, the coming and goings of things. So I immediately thought, well, this is the way I wanted the exhibition or the project and its program to function, as a series of movements, not nomadic, but a series of movements. So to make Documenta 11, I needed this great foil that was Documenta 10, because Documenta 10 insisted on the notion that discursive production was not only an annex, as you put it, but was vital and essential. In fact, it was part of the oxygen of an exhibition program. And Catherine was so kind to have invited me to be one of those guests. I don't even remember what I spoke about. I must have presented Johannesburg Biennale or something like that. But in any case, so this was the beginning of the idea. And so I wanted to bring this notion of constructing a horizon into the shape of Documenta 11.
Thank you so much. Now, maybe before we move on with some questions for Alan, I had one last question for both of you, and that's the idea of the archive, because it's extremely rare that an institution or an exhibition, a Biennale, usually there is very little archive, and there is a great degree of amnesia. Exhibitions are very poorly documented, and there is an astonishing thing in Kassel that there is this archive with letters and correspondence, and it's a very, very big archive of all the previous Documentas. There's even now, with Dorothea von Hantelmann, a professorship which researches this archive. So I was wondering if both of you can talk a little bit, if that archive what role that played, and if it was of any use.
I never actually stepped into the archive, personally. I never did because of the overwhelming power of the, of the precedents. That marked Documenta. I mean, everywhere you go in Kassel, you're surrounded by memories of Documenta. Adam is laughing. So it's in a sense an attempt to escape that dominant presence of Documenta as such, but while being attentive, to parts of it. I was not really, interested in falling into the cult of on the mythos, if you will, of Documenta. But one of the things I would like to say, though, is that what Documenta, gives you, despite its initial modesty when you start, because you start from zero, in a sense, despite its initial modesty, is a sense of this, incredible confidence. It's only in retrospect that you will think, oh my God, they were really incredible resources. That's after you've had experience of working elsewhere. It has incredible resources. But it's not systematic. And that is the challenge of Documenta, that it's almost always forgotten. The very moment if the last one ends, it's on to the next one. So it has not been systematically made available and public. Of course, I was invited relentlessly to come and visit it. And somehow, the day of the appointment was the day I was out of town. So I never really went to visit it. So it didn't really play any role but I think that the vivid experience of Catherine's Documenta was definitely something that, was quite strong and palpable.
Yeah, which is what Dan Graham always says, the importance of not looking too far back, but the just past, the Benjaminian idea of the just past. Katrin, what role did the archive play for you
in general, not the one in Kassel?
Yeah, in Kassel
because
and
the Documenta
in
archive is something of an issue. It seems to go a little bit better now, if I can refer to the young students. I don't know how it is with the Okwui, but we are absolutely chased by too many people writing thesis and so on and so forth. But for a long time, it has been a little bit difficult to find anything fast and when you would need. And the only part of the archive which was very, very well kept and you could really find things fast was the one Ari Zeman took with him in his house. And I think he did well because at least everything was under control and precise and accessible. And after, for the more general, because when Okwui mentioned a certain number of artists, I was thinking about a few other ones, and especially all of a sudden I don't remember his name. This very important Dutch architect, not Rem, the other one.
Winnie Maas?
No, the old one. He passed away after Documenta. Aldo, exactly. Aldo. Merci, Chris. Aldo. So it was you had many archives in the exhibition in a way. But frankly, when you ask me about archive, I think that there is a tendency today sometimes to make a confusion between an archive, between interpretation of the archive, and there is a kind of complaisance, no, in too much sometimes. In not any paper is interesting, not any element is bringing interesting things in an exhibition, and I'm eventually more interested in exhibitions which would revindicate very, very roughly the documentary DNA. When you were asking about referential exhibitions, unfortunately I threw it after Documenta because we met during Documenta, and I think he had the final push in Documenta for really delivering the show he really wanted to do for years. It's when you had this apartheid architecture, and after by
Hilton Juden.
Yeah, Don Judin, you know, for me it was absolutely precise, and even more the one before, which was smaller, which I saw in South Africa, and I don't think it's a show which could really travel, which was absolutely impressive. You had all the archive of the when people were expelled from District 6, and you had all the papers and the files which were in sandwich between two glasses, and you had to go through. And you had not so much space for going through. So this I found an amazing historical work and a very incisive exhibition dispositif, which was, I don't know if adding, but inviting you to look differently to the historical papers.
And it's great you mentioned Aldo van Eyck, because I remember when I visited your show, there was this magical moment. He was kind of late installing, and we ran into him, and he obviously, that's a great example of how an exhibition can protest against forgetting, because now so many artists all over the world work on Aldo van Eyck and the influence of playgrounds and all of that. But I would like to ask Adam a few questions. Obviously, Adam, very early days in your research. I don't know to which extent you can already talk about the projects, but I was
we won the artist list.
And I thought to begin, maybe it would be interesting to address you the same questions, you know, and I thought Catherine and Okwui so beautifully described how they related to the previous Documenta in either an antagonistic way or a non-antagonistic way. I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about your connection to, you know, the previous Documentas, and to which extent you feel the future will be constructed with fragments from the past.
I mean, the Documenta that Catherine David curated was the first one that I saw, and Okwui was the second, and these were the two that I liked best so far, and they were always, you know, of great importance. I wouldn't say inspiration, but importance. I think the trajectory that was described before in the historical development, or maybe not a development, but in the history of Documenta, from the first one of Arnold Bode to the one that Harald Semmel made, and those two editions that Catherine and Okwui made is quite a good summary of the history of this changing exhibition, which in a way has always taken place in the same city of Kassel, but sometimes one can get an impression that maybe cities are not as static or located as we may think, because especially after 1989, Kassel significantly traveled, so to say, because it changed from this position of the border city of Germany and the whole bloc to a relatively normal place in the middle of Germany and middle of Europe as well. So I understand the intentions behind both Documenta 10 and especially Documenta 11 was to kind of reinvent the border, to reinvent. It was necessary to reinvent the foe, as you were saying. So in a way, the problem had to be located elsewhere, and was no longer the East-West bloc division that I think already Jan Hout was in the late phase of his preparation to Documenta trying to deal with, because he included in the very last moment a number of artists from East Europe who were not properly, I think, included in the catalog, but on a sort of additional list. And that for me is significant of a kind of response or reaction to the change of historical circumstances after 1989. And I think that Documenta has always been, or it should have always been, an exhibition that is a response to an urgency. And the very moment when Documenta was born or formed, well, it wasn't born, it was organized. In 1955 is exactly that moment when a group of people, we talk about Bode, but there were a bit more of them, had an idea that bringing art to the place that is completely ravaged by the Second World War, and that is kind of robbed of any notion of identity that could be in any positive way connoted, that this situation can be somehow maybe not fixed, but it could be amended by an art exhibition that does something in this specific context, and it's not a context of the city of Kassel, because I mean there are many cities. I mean, I would say, of course, it's important that Documenta is taking place in Kassel, but it could also be taking place elsewhere, and it could be a significant exhibition. But I think Documenta, in the first place, it's a response to the kind of political and let's say also economic and social situation of a given moment, and it is in fact the only exhibition that has remained a kind of in your hands, especially both of you, a kind of diagnostical tool that helps us to understand something of the present. And in that sense, I think it's an exhibition that, it's not about zeitgeist, it's not about discovering something that is important for today and kind of defining it through the exhibition, but it is very much about formulating a significant statement in a given political and historical context. And I think that in that sense that the Documenta 10 and Documenta 11, that was to me a most logical step that followed, open doors that since then remain open, and we should basically make sure that these doors are never closing again, rather than trying to reinvent the whole strategy of the exhibition. So I think I wouldn't describe my ambitions of the exhibition as creating something of a game changer, because the rules of the game have been changed, and the fact that we are sitting here, for instance, and talking, to me it does have something to do with an impact that these two exhibitions and several other exhibitions and meetings, conferences and so forth produced. So in a way, we came to live in far more pluralistic environment than during the first 9 editions of Documenta, and I think we should be continuing in this direction, without, of course, giving details of such as names of artists and so forth. But I think this is of no interest. But I can tell you quantitatively that I think that there's going to be about 100 artists in Documenta.
For each single day.
I think that about 50 of them, or perhaps more, will be coming from outside of the something that was formerly known as European, Northern American context, or that it will be significantly including artists from all over the place without being an encyclopedia. And that I don't like encyclopedias as such, because I think that they are structuring tools that are taken for granted and should be dismissed towards more dispersed forms of knowledge production, to use the favorite word.
Now, one thing, Adam, which I thought would be interesting is the kind of, because both Kathleen and Okwui addressed the question of the local, the context in Kassel, and the global. I was kind of wondering if there's anything about Kassel you've been inspired by, or about your research. Before over coffee, we talked about Lucius Burckhardt and his sociological experiments in Kassel. Can you tell us about this? Yeah,
I was very inspired by an essay of Douglas Crimp, who's on Museum's Ruins, I think, begins with a description of another Documenta, one of the previous Documentas, before your Documentas. And this is a description which starts with this very beautiful, it starts in this kind of essayistic manner with a description of a visit that was paid to Kassel by an American gentleman in the late 19th century. And this gentleman describes Kassel as a place which is very prosperous and beautiful and so forth, but he also notes that this prosperity and the kind of beauty of Kassel, and I would also add, the creation of Fridericianum in the late 18th century as this kind of almost like premonition of enlightenment that fell over Kassel. So despite all of these beauties and despite the entire Enlightenment, the point that has to be made is that the landgraves of Hessia, who were ruling this country, were trading in men, as this American man wrote. So basically, Kassel was a place that sent mercenaries to other countries, such as America, and these mercenaries were fighting on the side of the British in the Civil War. So basically, it is not a place in which we're gonna necessarily discover, some beautiful corners and some elements of picturesque, but it is as well a place in which we may seek for major rifts or contradictions historically that are going to show also there, also in Kassel, like in many other places. So I think it's not a bad place to start, but it's not a place that is ever going to become a focus or a subject matter of at least this exhibition. Since it also did have, for instance, it had many years ago a very interesting exhibition called the Kassel in the year 1955, which was the year of Documenta. It was organized by a city museum of Kassel. And this exhibition showed the immediate urban and social context of this year in which Documenta emerged. And it absolutely did not focus on Documenta. It focused on everything that was happening in the city, like aside from Documenta, such as the scarcity of means and the scarcity of food even, and the situation of people living in ruins and the first effort of reconstruction. So that kind of thematized Kassel to me. But I wouldn't think that is really necessarily so important or pertinent for Documenta to explore some kind of genius loci. I mean, a couple of walks are always good and exhilarating and healthy, but I don't think that one should get too lost in this walking and thinking.
Now, Okwui mentioned that he's never been in the archive. Has the archive played a role for you in Kassel, the Documenta archive? Or?
I visited, and it's difficult to research. It needs a lot of effort and probably a lot of money to bring it to the form that will be like full availability. But I kind of like the idea of archives that are not fully accessible or available. They have something mysterious about them. And I also remember I mean, it's very hard to beat Hans Ulrich on anecdotes, but let me bring one, because I did happen to meet Harald Semann once or twice. And on his first visit that took place in a small art space in Warsaw that I used to work at, called Galeria Foksal, must have been around 1993, I think. And we had a copy of When Attitudes Become Form catalog in the gallery. And this copy was eaten by some kind of worms, like half eaten. So it had a lot of holes. And we were kind of embarrassed to show it to Harald Semann, but he liked it a lot, and we asked him to sign it for us. And he not only signed, but he was sitting there in our office, which had a very beautiful archive of many artists who showed in this art space or gallery since 1966 until then 1993. And he was looking at these boxes with documentation, and he just added one word on the cover, which was archives. Because his exhibition When Attitudes Become Form had this lengthy subtitle, which I think included, for instance, situations and such things, but the word archives was not on it. So he himself, recognized the importance of like archiving. But in the beginning, I was very glad that he gave it a thought. But after a while, I came to the conclusion that exhibition should not become. I mean, the word Documenta. First of all, very nice that it's plural, so it has a kind of possibility of multiplicity built into the project. But second, it's also something decisively anti-monumental about it. So it should not, I think, run into risk of becoming kind of monument to its own being Documenta. So it should have a form that is changing and kind of perpetuating, but not really ossifying in some kind of contemplation of the importance of Documenta, which is a very interesting task, I think, for the Documenta Institute that is at the moment being discussed quite vividly in Kassel. And if such an institute is created, then of course it will be a place of research on Documenta and hopefully also other exhibitions. But Documenta itself should be rather the responsive exhibition, I think.
There could not be a more wonderful conclusion. We now do have the time. I think I was promising Schumann that we will not make this a marathon, so we can have 2 or 3 urgent questions for our speakers.
We have time for 2 very precise questions, and if it is not a precise question, it will not be put to the panelists. So, okay. Please wait for the mic.
Hello. Please don't judge me if I am go some way to another side, but I am very, very interested after this very historical and enormous view of Documenta de Kassel that all of us, we believe. I would like to know, and don't judge me please, what do you think about, let's say, the present of the creativity in these areas of the world? How do you predict, how do you see what's going on in this particular evolution in the Middle East, in the region? How healthy do you see this? The minus, the plus, sorry.
Don't judge her.
Catherine, want to take that?
What part of the region? Because the region is very vague. It's because we have the Gulf, we have the Middle East, which is something very different. So, I think the region is not on the moon. I'm always beginning with that, The same like when people said you were the first woman, I always said, I am very sorry, but I won't change my sex because of Documenta. When people ask me, how do you feel as a woman? I felt stupid, I was not even offended. Okay, so the Middle East and the Gulf are not on the moon, and the regions, because there are different regions, are affected by a certain number of political problems we should know for some people, and it's also affected by others, which have to do with a certain kind of instrumentalization of art and culture through economical processes and so on and so forth, and it's maybe affecting deeper places where you have not a long institutional tradition in order to maintain a certain kind of balance and or alternative, even if I'm not too confident about alternative, even outside from the Gulf and Middle East. And with all that, you have a certain number of very strong energies, a certain number of works and oeuvres sometimes. And the thing is, what are we speaking about these days? This morning I was in Sharjah, and I have to say that I was extremely, I wasn't there for 4 years, and I was extremely impressed by the development of the, I won't call it a museum, by the development of the foundation and the cultural spaces they established in the old Sharjah. It's especially interesting because what I call the old Sharjah is probably for a certain number of Sharjawi people the old Sharjah. And for me it's more an invented tradition, but it's not at all a problem. And I saw a certain number of small projects, precise, which have strong, and I think especially to an artist who is quite difficult to show without overframing, without distorting, without ridiculing, and it was unfortunately the case in Venice a few years ago, Abdallah al-Saadi. And, I think showing him, if you have to do it in a very special way. So, again, the region, it's Abdallah al-Saadi, for me, as much as other names which are much more famous. and as such other too many works from my point of view, which have more to do with the gadgetization of problems, and sometimes even coming from artists I would consider as good and intelligent. And but when I'm saying that, I'm looking at you. I know why I'm here, and I'm also thinking, Catherine, what you are saying now and here, you could say it in many other places. So after, it's a question of scales. It's a question of the intensity of the way a certain set of economical and political problems are affecting a production. But I'm not so sure that it's all special. You have here, it's a kind maybe more when you would look to, it's another word I never remember in English, une loupe. En Zurich, une loupe. La loupe. Yeah, thank you. It's like, anyway, for me, when I'm here and I'm looking at things, it's magnifier. So I see maybe some things clearer, but I don't feel I'm on the moon when I'm here.
Thank you very much. We want to squeeze in 2 more questions. So, Alex.
Thank you. The title of this discussion is provocatively called Documenta Century, dating up to 2055. Obviously, it's a big ask to do that kind of futurology, but it's noticeable that you haven't really maybe addressed what might happen. It's certainly obvious that Documenta started in a particular location with a particular political and cultural agenda, and that has evolved as the world has changed around it. In 6 editions' time, I think it'll be in 2047 or 7. And I'm just wondering if the panel might want to consider or wonder about whether Documenta needs to still be around in 30 years' time, or whether, as one speaker mentioned yesterday, about cities being forgotten, one day Dubai will be forgotten, one day London will be forgotten. Will Documenta be still necessary? Will it be still necessary to have it around, or will it be something remembered?
Adam?
We shall see. I think it's a good question. It's a relevant question, and it's difficult to answer because there are so many variables that would make it necessary or not for Documenta to exist in 2047 or 55. I mean, the logic of the enterprise and the current economic situation in Germany allows us to speculate that Documenta might be in existence in 2055, but I'm not really sure whether this will be the case, because there's these variables. The situation's been changing dynamically lately. For instance, Ukraine, things like this. So I don't really know.
Okwui, what's your view?
Well, not to be prognostic, but I think it would definitely be around. And there are 2 reasons why I think that Documenta will be around in 2055. First, it has to do with the relative remoteness of Kassel, in spite of its centrality in the middle of Europe, that kind of enables the cultivation of the kind of program that Documenta represents in relative tranquility. And second is the duration of each unfolding of Documenta every 5 years. Means that the capacity for the institution to exhaust its relevance is mitigated, if you will, by the fact that it does not occur frequently. And that means, to sort of borrow Catherine's phrase, it gives you time to say what you want to say. And that luxury of time, that luxury of concentration, which in many ways is not a luxury that many other biennials have, that have also, that has also proved fatal to many biennials, even though they are still in existence, but there is an increasing sense of obsolescence of those biennials because of the rapidity of their occurrence. So these two things, I believe, weighs greatly in the positive balance of the ledger for Documenta to be able to, in a sense, to continue. And I think that also has to do with, shall we say, both the art historical and cultural specificity of Documenta's own contributions. And it's done so in very considered and considerable ways. It is really one of the few places in a group exhibition where you could have, different relationships formed around different thoughts. That you could have an essay exhibition within the thematic, within the group exhibition. You can have a cluster of themes or a constellation of themes within the, this group, format, and to do that with, as great a precision as the organizer could manage. And I think all these things are very relevant to Documenta. And I don't say it because, I've been involved in one of the editions, but there really isn't a changing exhibition event in the world like Documenta. And this is something that makes it, incredibly important. My only fear is that we don't want it to be taken over by UNESCO.
It also ties in beautifully with what earlier today Camp said, the sort of whole link to Fernand Braudel, long durational things. And Dominique Gonzalez-Förster told me the other day, she was talking about, the Münster project, it happens every 10 years, and she was even evoking that maybe there should be shows which happen only every 50 years. So we should push that further.
The ones that we can call occasionals.
Exactly.
Yeah, instead of biennials, occasionals.
It's a neologism.
We really run out of time. You can ask the last question if you can guarantee that it's possibly the best question that's ever been asked in the history of questions. Can you? Really? It's a lot of pressure, I know.
Hi, I have a question to David, actually. I represent Ukraine, and probably all of you know what is happening right now in our country. So we strive to be a part of Europe, but unfortunately we have some political problems with Russia. Do you follow the situation? Are you going to somehow represent or raise this issue of the country who wants to be part of Europe but goes there very difficult? I mean, Documenta usually always was a place where Europe is talking about the world and Europe itself. So I'm interested whether you will be involving some of Ukrainian artists or anyhow tries to touch this issue. Thank you. Sorry.
Well, it's a little bit like talking about the future of the past, because in 3 years, thank you, 4 years, 3 years. Documenta. The situation in Ukraine will be hopefully. Will be different, and hopefully it will go in some, better direction. And I don't think there is something that needs to be done now, but I don't think that I can imagine the problem of Ukraine to be an important part of Documenta, because why exactly? Imagine an exhibition in 3 years that should tackle the problem of Ukraine, which is very much a problem of today. And there is an initiative I heard of, if one is to take the words of Что делать and Dmitry Vilensky and other people at face value, then it seems that they actually are thinking, after pulling out of Manifesta, of maybe mounting an exhibition that would be more about, you know, solidarity and building something between or across between the nations or across national borders of the entire kind of post-Soviet world. That would be certainly important, and perhaps Manifesta has also represented a similar chance, and I guess the interpretation of the exhibition by Stodielac and their gesture of pulling out of it was also meant politically, especially in the context of what has been going on in Ukraine right now. But yes, there is and there probably will be a kind of cultural manifestation that addresses or thematizes you know, the current developments in Ukraine. But I don't think it will be a part of my work on Documenta.
So I hope we can continue this conversation now in a coffee break, and I'd like to thank so much Katrin and Okwui and Adam, and thank you all very, very much. Thank you.